So I'm so glad to be part of this conversation on engaging Christian virtue. And as the Dean said, looking at the virtue of temperance. Again, I'm Patrick Cheng, the theologian in residence at St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue. And, I think the relevance of Christian virtues today is it's highly relevant. And I'm glad that we're also looking back to sort of the classical virtues. I think as a theologian, it's important to talk about my social location, and including my dog, Shark, that I love very much. But I just wanted to, because I understand that you had a lot of different speakers coming from different kinds of backgrounds and academic disciplines. And so I just wanted to mention that I am a systematic theologian. I earned my doctorate at Union Theological Seminary with Dr. James Cone, the founder of Black Theology. And, I currently serve, as I mentioned, at St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue, and I also teach at Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary. And my main sort of academic focus has been on the discipline of queer theology. I've written a trilogy of sorts. Actually, Radical Love is an introduction to queer theology. I then wrote From Sin to Amazing Grace, which is to rethink the doctrines of sin and grace from the perspective of LGBTQ people. And then my most recent book has been Rainbow Theology, which is talking about bridging race, sexuality, and spirituality. And I'm also pleased that my books have been translated into a number of different languages, especially East Asian languages, Radical Love in Chinese and Japanese and Korean. And I think that's a conversation that really needs to happen, especially in East Asia, in terms of queer theology and LGBTQ rights. So that's just a little bit background in terms of where I'm coming from. And my understanding is that you've gone through many of the virtues, the theological virtues, right, of faith, hope, and love. And of course, that comes from, 1 Corinthians, the great chapter on love. And now faith, hope, and love abide, right? The pistis and the elpis and the agape in the Greek. And then also the cardinal virtues, right? So the prudence, practical wisdom, justice, giving those what they are due. And then temperance tonight in terms of moderation, and then fortitude and courage. And of course, the cardinal virtues go back to classical times, Plato and Aristotle, and then even sort of early Christian traditions with Ambrose and Augustine, and of course, Aquinas. But, just in terms of talking about temperance, well, also just sort of the Apocrypha, right? The Book of Wisdom does mention the four virtues, the cardinal virtues. And in this translation, you see that wisdom teaches self-control, which is temperance here, and prudence, and justice, and courage or fortitude, right? And so, this word sophrosune, that's sort of the word for fortitude. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today. And then in the Latin too. Now it's interesting, the Latin translation of wisdom, right? It talks about sobrietatem, in terms of Latin, in terms of the self-control. So, I really love this stained glass window about temperance. I think it's really appropriate because it's about this unruly horse, right, that has a bridle that is being sort of, controlled. You see the hand there, right? And that's really what temperance is about, right? Like, controlling our unruly passions, if you will, whether it's food or drink or sex. And so, so when I had the chance to, choose from some of these virtues of being a queer theologian, I thought, well, I couldn't pass up the chance to talk about temperance. So I was pretty excited about that. And one of the things I'm excited about too is that I think Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is probably like the best notion of temperance out there. It might be like, well, why, what does Gene Wilder and all this have to do with anything? But, if you think about these bratty children, right? I mean, right, you think about Augustus Gloop, with his gluttony, and you think about Veruca Salt and her greed, and Violet Beauregard and chewing gum, and Mike Teavee, they're all sort of examples of intemperance, right? And sort of the classical notion of temperance is saying that intemperance is really a childish vice, if you will, because you think of sort of this unruly, sort of uncabined notion. And I just think Charlie and Chocolate Factory is a wonderful way of thinking about temperance and intemperance. So I just wanted to start off with that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, St. Thomas Aquinas, right, the 13th century theologian, really talked a lot about temperance as well as the other virtues. Sort of his Summa Theologiae is structured around that. And so I do want to spend some time talking about Aquinas's view on temperance. And in particular, the second part of the, the Secunda Secundae, questions 141 to 170. And so, here's a passage from Augustine, I'm sorry, not Augustine, Aquinas, in terms of, his talking about temperance. And he says, temperance is the name of a virtue, right? Ea est virtus quae temperantia nominator. So he uses the Latin word temperantia here. And he says, its very name implies moderation or temperateness, which reason causes. And so, temperance is about moderation, right? In eius nomine importator quaedam moderatio, or temperateness, sir temperies, quam ratio facit. So really it's about reason, right? So it's not just moderation and temperance for its own sake, but, using reason as a guide to find what is, sort of moderate in terms of these, two extremes, which we'll talk about. And so, another example, in addition to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I think of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? So you've got Goldilocks and the porridge bowls. And, you've got, too cold, right, on one side, which is really deficiency, as Aquinas talks about it. And then on the other side, you've got too hot, right, which is excess. And then, of course, you have the mean, which is just right. And so again, there's this really interesting notion of moderation that, is not unique to Aquinas, and obviously goes back to Aristotle and the classical philosophy. And, this quote from Diana Fritz Cates, who is a professor at the University of Iowa in the Religious Studies Department, I think sums up well. She says, temperance is the disposition that orders desires and pleasures connected to the use of food, drink, and sexual relations. Appetitive rectitude with respect to food, drink, and sexual relations is a consistent desiring and enjoying of these goods in a way that conduces to the good functioning of the human organism and the human community as a whole. For Thomas, proper functioning requires minimally the preservation of self and species. And as we'll see, again, the application of reason, dictates that we look to the preservation of the self and the species in determining what does that mean in respect to temperance. And so, as I'd mentioned before, the three main species of temperance that Aquinas talks about is, one is food, second is drink, and third is sex. And so again, I think what ties these together is this notion of, sensuality and touch, as Aquinas says. And so there are other kinds of temperance, which I'll talk to later, but food, drink, and sex are the big three here. And so, it's interesting, right? He sets up this sort of these binaries, and then he sort of argues where temperance goes. So in terms of food, right, you have deficiency on the one hand, right, like the Goldilocks. You've got starvation. And it's interesting, Aquinas doesn't actually name what deficiency is in terms of the food. It's just deficiency. But for our purposes, I sort of talk about starvation or self-starvation as a way of thinking about deficiency on the one end. And then on the other end, in terms of excess, I think about, gluttony. And so that is sort of one of our 7 deadly sins, and that is named in Aquinas in terms of, sort of the other end in terms of food. And so what Aquinas names in terms of the mean here is abstinence. And I think it's, it's a term of art. I think, you think of abstinence and you think of giving up something, right? Giving up meat or, sort of giving up something for Lent. But really, abstinence is Aquinas's word for where, you know, the temperance line is drawn in terms of food. Okay. We've talked about food. You know, let's talk about drink here. You know, again, you have the deficiency. You know, obviously Aquinas doesn't use the word teetotalism, you know, but I just sort of use that as sort of this notion of, you know, abstinence from drink. And, you know, it's sort of, what would that look like? It's interesting, you know, I think sort of perhaps an example might just be that even if someone needed alcohol for medication purposes, they're so repulsed by it, right, that you know, that they would not have alcohol. Now, of course, you know, with alcohol, it is complicated because some people do abstain. And so this is where prudence and sort of using practical wisdom, you know, it matters, which is interesting because in the realm of sex, it is much more of an absolute as opposed to sort of this notion of discerning. But on the other hand of deficiency, you've got excess, which is drunkenness, right? And so again, you know, Aquinas draws the line here in terms of drink as what he calls sobriety, right? So sobriety is the equivalence to abstinence in the food realm. That's where he talks about drink. So as you can see, I'm just sort of walking you through, right, the big three and how Aquinas sets up, you know, where he thinks temperance should be. Now, this is really interesting stuff, right? We get to sex. And so, you know, of course, on the one hand, you have deficiency. And again, it's really interesting. Aquinas doesn't really have words for deficiency. I'm not sure what that's about, you know, in terms of the lack. So I put on labels myself, frigidity here, right? But you know, the flip side of that is the excess is lust. And again, you know, this is one of the 7 deadly sins. And it's really interesting that when you look at the medieval 7 deadly sins, so many of them have to do with temperance, right? I mean, you've seen gluttony, you've seen lust, and you know, later on you'll also see that pride and anger are also subcategories of temperance or wrath, if you will. So it's interesting how a lot of this, you know, sort of convenes or converges here. But again, sort of temperance in terms of that mean between frigidity and lust here is what he calls chastity. And so, you know, and it's interesting because chastity, how Aquinas justifies the sexual act, and I think in some ways, you know, for the 13th century, it's progressive in the sense that, you know, look, it's not an absolute prohibition because it is needed for the continuation of the human race, right? And this is, you know, the quote that we heard earlier. I mean, just like food and drink is required for individual flourishing and life, sex is required for, you know, to continue the human species. And the question is, you know, that, you know, in Aquinas's mind is the reason or the ratio, you know, for engaging in this, but finding the right place between the two extremes. And I just find it interesting that sort of this whole notion of Neo-Thomistic sexual ethics, right? This, this new Thomistic thinking has really taken what is sort of this notion of discernment and sort of the mean between two extremes and has codified it into some absolute. And so in some ways, in my mind, it is not consistent with what Aquinas was saying, certainly in terms of the methodology. And again, you know, sort of the focus on natural law, right? That what is always true for all time, you know, the absolute right and wrong. You know, I think, so you know, the Neo-Thomistic thinking goes back to what Thomas writes about in sort of his conversation on temperance, or his section about the 6 parts of lust, right? And so I just want to sort of get into some of the details here, but it's really interesting, right? In question 154, article 1, he lists sort of the 6 parts of lust, and they are all sort of sexual acts that are against reason. And so, you know, he starts, and you see the numbers on the right-hand side. I numbered the 6 here, right? So the vice against nature, the vitium contra naturam, is, you know, sort of, is against reason because it is against reproduction, right? Against the begetting of children. And then you have fornication, sort of sex before marriage, the fornicatio simplex, which is against reason because it does not provide the context in which children can be raised, which is marriage. So did you see this? All of it is arguing sort of that these are against, these are acts against reason. He talks about incest, incestus, which is, against reason in terms of the wrong relationships, in terms of being related by blood or affinity. And then fourth, adultery, adulterium, seduction, stuprum, and rape, raptus. And it's interesting because those are against reason because the woman, in this case, is actually sort of, you are taking the woman against the authority under which the woman is located, whether it's the father or the husband, right? So that is really what's against reason. And so it's really interesting that sort of this is his reasoning in terms of these different parts of lust. And in particular, the vice against nature, sodomy and others, he says really is sort of the greatest vice of them all. And it's interesting that you'll see that, other things, including masturbation, is included there. And, one theologian or ethicist was saying, like today, you'd find very hard for someone to say that the act of masturbation is worse than rape, for example. But this is what Aquinas is arguing in terms of the vice against nature. And so this unnatural vice, and so again, it's interesting, right? That he goes into the four kinds. One is the sin of uncleanliness, right? The immunditiae, which is the self-pleasuring or masturbation, bestiality, bestialitas, and then the vice of sodomy, sodomiticum vitium. And then finally, this very curious, other monstrous and bestial manners of copulation, right? Ad alios monstruosos et bestiales concumbendi modus. So, your guess is as good as mine. But anyway, so these are the four types of unnatural vices that constitute this. So I think I should have mentioned that in addition to being a theologian, prior to becoming ordained as an Episcopal priest, I was a lawyer in a previous life, and not just any lawyer, but a tax lawyer. And so I can really relate to Aquinas's sort of lovely sort of architecture of, sort of, it's like the tax code, right? So I definitely do appreciate this. And so if you're interested in this, temperance is where all this good stuff is. And so I couldn't help but, share some of this with you all. And again, I think, if you think back to the 13th century and, which is many centuries later than Augustine of Hippo, I mean, he really is responding to the notion of original sin, right? That the fall in Genesis 3, like the original sin is really passed on. I mean, I've often said it's like a virus, right? It's passed on through sex. Right, that original sin, and it is the disobedience, not only the disobedience of our primal parents, Adam and Eve, but the disobedience of the sex act, if you will, the concupiscence, that is passed on and therefore taints the sexual act. And so Aquinas is actually in some ways justifying why sexual pleasure is not per se bad. Right, so again, if you go back to that context, it is progressive in the sense that he's saying, okay, if you look at sort of using reason, you look at the procreation or the perpetuation of the species, then it is consistent with reason, right? That's what he's saying. Just like you need to eat and drink, to be, the perpetuation of one's own life, but not to excess. And so that's sort of where his argument is going. But again, with Neo-Thomas, it has become such a rigid thinking that I think the architecture of the argument has gotten lost into categories of what is always permitted and what is never permitted. And so I think that's something important to think about. And I think as we talk about sexual ethics, I do think, one of these things is rethinking this notion of chastity, right? That again, as I mentioned before, you have the deficiency of frigidity on the one hand, you have the excess of lust on the other, and you have chastity in the middle, which is really about the generatio prolis, right? The generation of offspring, to be fruitful. I think to what does that mean today? Well, I think the generatio prolis, I think what a lot of ethicists and theologians would say today is that we're not just talking about purely biological generativity, right? I mean, generativity is not just a matter of biology, right? One must have a broader view of generativity. So you can affirm, I think, Aquinas's structure And this is, I love this quote from Margaret Farley, the emerita professor of ethics at Yale Divinity School, a Catholic nun whose work was roundly condemned by the Vatican. But nonetheless, her wonderful book on sexual ethics, Just Love, she says, look, the new life within the relationship of those who share it may move beyond itself in countless ways, nourishing other relationships, providing goods, services, and beauty for others, informing the fruitful work lives of the partners in relation, helping to raise other people's children, and on and on. All these ways and more may constitute the fruit of a love for which persons in relation are responsible. So basically, Farley is saying that generativity does not have to be biological, that any relationship, any sexual relationship, does give birth to new life to the extent that it moves beyond itself, right? That it creates new life in these other ways with other people, other contexts. And that is a fruit of a love. That is the generatio prolis. And so I think, as we talk about this, again, it's not just a matter of arguing against, absolute acts and not. I think there's a lot of richness in the tradition that we've barely begun to scratch the surface in terms of, sort of thinking about how we might, mine these riches and think about them in different ways. And so, this idea of broader view of generativity, right? Same gender loving, same sex, different relationships, you can find this notion of generativity. And again, here's a picture of my spouse, Michael, and I, and here's Chartres again. This was taken 10 years ago when we got legally married. I'm proud to say that next summer, Michael and I will have been together for 30 years. We met when I was just 1 year out of law school. But, I like to think that because of this relationship, it has given both of us, sort of the security to go out and be generative, right, in terms of our vocations in a way that we could not have otherwise. And so to me, I think that's just sort of an argument and discourse that I feel like no one ever really talks about. So anyway, just wanted to take this privilege to just share some, in terms of my own personal background. I want to, sort of mention that temperance is not just about food, sex, or food, drink, and sex in that order. There's also a number of other vices that Aquinas talks about that would be really interesting to talk about at some point. The wrath, or not just anger. It's interesting, Aquinas actually says anger is a good thing, and the lack of anger, lack of righteous anger is sometimes a vice, or can be a vice, right? Think about, sort of Episcopalians and our niceties and refusing to stir the pot. I think we could learn something about sort of, the importance of anger, but excessive anger, wrath, as opposed to meekness is something that is a vice. Cruelty, as opposed to clemency, which is the temperance. Pride versus humility. And I love this one, curiositas, which sounds like curiosity in the Latin sounds like curiosity in the English. It's really about snooping, right? People, people who love to snoop and are a little bit too like, always, that's a vice, as opposed to studiousness. So it's one thing to be curious in terms of wanting to learn. It's another thing if you sort of are, just looking, to learn or to being a snoop. Anyway, so this is a fascinating part of temperance. And then finally, sort of immodesty of dress. That's in there too. So Aquinas has all kinds of stuff here. So I just want to mention that. And I think we're coming up to the half hour. So I just want to close by saying that I also want to talk about something, as a queer theologian, I want to talk about sort of the logic of temperance that I was alluding to, sort of the notion of these two binaries and finding this mean, right? This notion. And for me, it really is sort of an example of non-binary thinking that not only the Neo-Thomists, but most people, sort of Aquinas scholars, don't really think about. This notion of finding this non-binary thinking versus binary on-off black-white thinking, right? So it's sort of this in-between space, like again, sort of like the, being in between two different spaces here. So again, we've talked about temperance as, and I want to argue that the logic of temperance is really non-binary thinking. You have starvation and gluttony, you have teetotalism and drunkenness, you have frigidity and lust. And what you have in the between, abstinence, sobriety, and chastity, right? Temperance. That occurs in the middle. And you sort of use prudence to kind of figure out where you lie in the spectrum, right? It's a rejection of the binaries. And so I want to argue that from a queer theory perspective, I think that's something that's really interesting, right? And so, you know, sort of, I also want to give other examples why non-binary thinking is so important in my own life. You know, as an Asian American, you know, first generation immigrant, my parents and I moved here when I was 1. And I always say that, you know, sort of walking in the front door and walking out is just like 2 different worlds, that threshold, you know, sort of speaking Chinese inside and, you know, just sort of very traditional Chinese household, and then going out to school and everything. But, you know, also when I visited East Asia, when I've given talks, you know, in China and Hong Kong, look, Asia, I may look like I belong there, but I certainly don't think like that. And my Chinese is passable, but barely, versus American, which I think like that. But, you know, I'll walk into a store and sometimes people can't even think I can speak English, you know, notwithstanding sort of, you know, I'm fairly well educated. But I'm just saying, you know, I fall in between that binary. And then, you know, when I was at Union Theological, I mean, I loved working with Dr. Cohn. And I always said, you know, look, so much about race relations in America is about black versus white. Where does yellow fall into that, right? So where is Asian America in between Asia and America? And where's yellow in between black and white, or red or brown, right? I mean, you know, again, sort of Asian American experience is non-binary thinking. I could go on. Queerness, I mean, clearly a lot of queer theory is non-binary thinking. You've got the poles of woman and man, feminine, masculine, female, male, even heterosexual, homosexual. And what's really queer, right, is genderqueer, non-binary, androgynous, intersex, or bisexuality. Again, I think what's really interesting is this middle space of non-binary thinking. And I could go on, but you can all relate, I think. And, you know, Christianity is non-binary thinking. I mean, this is a point that I make in some of my works, that you have all these binaries of divinity and humanity, life and death, and eternity and finitude and grace and sin. Well, what is at the very middle of all of these binaries but Jesus Christ, right? At the very heart of Christianity is the one who is both divine and human, is the one who is both, you know, incarnate but died, but then come back to life. The one who has eternal time span, but is finite, you know, in terms of the earthly ministry. The one who forgives our sins, but through grace, and yet takes on our sins. I think this mode of thinking that is, I think, about temperance, is about these different modes of thought. And finally, even Anglicanism, right? You have sort of Protestantism and Catholicism. I mean, how did our lovely Anglican Episcopal tradition get born out of? But, you know, Henry VIII and this middle space and this non-binary notion of finding sort of this mean between the Protestant, the Reformed tradition and the Catholic tradition. So I just want to close by saying I think there's a lot of really interesting things that we can talk about, the significance of temperance. I tried to set out some, you know, sort of the traditional Aquinas structure of that, but, you know, I wanted to suggest a few things that might be interesting to talk about. One is sort of the broader view of generativity. I don't think we have to throw out generativity, right? That we can expand our definition of that. Just like my own work in terms of rethinking sin and grace, I think sometimes progressive communities just throw out the baby in the bathwater, and I think it's actually more harmful not to have ways of thinking about these theological notions. But more importantly, I really want to explore the notion of temperance, and this appears in other virtues too, about as non-binary thinking, right? Moving beyond option A versus option B, and really finding that sort of middle space. And I think Aquinas, drawing upon the classical Aristotelian notions, does that. And I think it's time that we can also sort of engage that, and among other things, queer theory. So with that, I end the presentation, and you know, I think we can move on to questions from Dr. Nelson or comments.